Just to start, we are recording this webinar and it will be available on careersinenergy.ca next week. In the spirit of reconciliation, we would like to start by honoring our ancestors and acknowledging the Treaty 7 territory. We acknowledge the Treaty 7 nations, the Siksika First Nation, the Piikani First Nation, the Kaurna First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. We acknowledge the ancestral territory of the Siksika Sitapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the home of Métis Region Number 3. Finally, we acknowledge all nations, Indigenous and non, who live, work, and play on this land and who honor and celebrate this territory. The project that we're talking about today was funded by the province of Alberta, working in partnership with the Government of Canada to provide employment support programs and services. Opinions shared in this webinar are PetroLMI's and do not necessarily reflect those of the government. So to get started, I am Brianne. I'm the program manager for the Petroleum Labor Market Information Division of Energy Safety Canada, and I'm here with Lisette Cameron, our analyst. So the PetroLMI Division of Energy Safety Canada has a mandate to collaborate with industry, government, educators, and training agencies to support and advance the development of a sustainable, skilled, and productive workforce. We specialize in providing oil and gas labor market data and insights, as well as resources for workforce and career planning. Today, we'll be talking about our latest report focused on Alberta well closures. This report pulled together secondary research and findings from interviews with 7 energy services companies and 3 industry associations to highlight the chain of activities involved in closures, as well as the key well servicing and environmental occupations involved and the competencies required, including the top in-demand roles. In this webinar, we will be focusing on the activities involved in closure, the opportunities and challenges related to the site rehabilitation program here in Alberta, and discuss recommendations going forward. I then invite you to attend our next webinar at 11 this morning, where we'll focus on the occupations in demand. There should be a Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to enter your questions as they arise during the presentation, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but we may address some questions throughout if they're related to something that's on the screen. So, the federal and provincial governments have created new financial initiatives and policy measures to create jobs and work with the oil and gas industry to improve the environment. Measures such as the COVID-19 Economic Response Plan, the Alberta Site Rehabilitation Program, and the Provincial Liability Management Framework are intended to address a significant inventory of inactive wells. So a little bit about the SRP, that's the Site Rehabilitation Program. The SRP aims to get Alberta's specialized oil and gas labor force back to work, to accelerate site abandonment and reclamation efforts, and to complete a high volume of environmentally significant work. The program provides grants during several designed funding periods, starting with period 1, which opened May 2020. The grants cover varying percentages of the total program costs, depending on the specific criteria for each period. The SRP is currently expected to end in March 2022, and all work for the grants must be completed by December 2022. So how do you go about reclaiming a well site? Closure is the last stage of the life cycle of an oil and gas well. And you can see here that the stages start at stage number 1, where an abandoned well is one taken out of service and permanently shut down, plugged, the wellhead is removed, and it's considered safe and secure by regulators. The decommissioning stage is removing as much infrastructure as possible from the site, facilities, surface pipelines, wells. The only infrastructure continued to be an improvement can be left on the land. So that might be like an access road for a landowner, and a landowner's written permission is required to leave any infrastructure on the land. Then there is the site assessment and the remediation phases. So that's where you are going to be assessing a site for any contamination of soil or groundwater. And if any contaminated materials are found, remove them and take them to a disposal facility or treatment facility, or treat them on site. And then finally, reclamation is returning the land to its pre-disturbed state or an equivalent yet land use through activities like replacing the topsoil, landscaping, ongoing soil and water sampling is done there as well. So many stakeholders play an active role in the management of activities related to well closure in Alberta. Alberta Energy administers the site rehabilitation program and sets the policy for the liability management framework. The Alberta Energy Regulator ensures safe, efficient, orderly, and environmentally responsible development of Alberta's energy resources through regulation and enforcement. The Orphan Well Association manages the production and closure of oil and gas wells, pipelines, and facilities that no longer have an owner, including remediation and reclamation work. They receive funding through the Orphan Fund levy that is paid by producers. Oil and gas producers are responsible for closure activities for their own well sites, and they also pay into that Orphan Fund levy that's administered by the OWA. Under the new liability management framework, active site operators will have a mandatory 5-year rolling spending target for site reclamation work. And then service companies, the well servicing, environmental services, are contracted by the producers or the OWA to complete the abandonment, decommissioning, remediation, and reclamation work. So some typical services we'll get into a little bit more in a couple slides here, but they include the site inspection, the service rigs, trucking and hauling, wireline operations, environmental assessments and reviews, and reclamation supervision. Indigenous communities, so First Nations and Métis settlements, can nominate on reserve and on settlement sites for closure. Indigenous businesses are also actively encouraged and supported to play a role in closure work. And finally, landowners can nominate sites for closure activities on their properties. So well closure activities are poised to have a significant and lasting impact on Alberta's energy industry. With close to, actually, I'm going to do a quick poll before I continue on here, because I was about to give an answer. So I am launching the poll right now. How many inactive and orphan wells do you think there are in Alberta? Oh, looks like you guys are 100% right. So there are 105,000 inactive wells. So everybody got it right. Good job. So I'll go back to my slide here. So there are close to 105 inactive and orphaned wells across the province, and 35 to 50 services that employ between 41 to 57 workers are required for closure activities per well. So increased closure activity is already creating or sustaining thousands of jobs while contributing to responsible resource development. In the shorter term, the SRP will play a key role in site closure activities, and over the longer term, the opportunities for Indigenous involvement and the integration of emerging sectors like hydrogen and geothermal through the repurposing of oil and gas infrastructure could be transformative. Now I'm turning it over to Lisette.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to keep my my video off while I present. My computer gets glitchy sometimes, so thank you, Brianne. So as Brianne mentioned, increased closure activity is creating or sustaining thousands of jobs while contributing to responsible resource development. And this slide shows you the progress that has been made since the SRP was launched May 1st, 2020. And this information is up to August 10th, but I actually do have some more up-to-date figures I can give you. So as of October 22nd, so as of last Friday, 52,822 applications have been submitted. 52,765 applications have been processed. 25,591 applications have been approved. And of that, 61% are for abandonment work and 39% are for remediation and reclamation work. In total, $538 million in grant funding has been approved and is being allocated to more than 500 Alberta-based companies. And as of October 22nd, 2,577 jobs have been created to date. And that's as estimated by oil field services companies in their applications. So grant funding through the site rehabilitation program is available in $100 million increments with targeted priorities, application criteria, and timelines. So starting in grant period 4 of the SRP, which started in August of 2020, there's been a focus on conducting business with Indigenous oil field service providers. Normally, projects are eligible for up to 50% grant funding. However, if a producer contracts an Indigenous oil field services company, it can receive up to 100% of the project value. As part of this increased focus, a list of Indigenous contractors has also been made available on the SRP website. And Indigenous companies can get advice and support with their application through the government's dedicated Indigenous liaison and from the Indian Resource Council. So fast forward to grant period 6, which started in February of this year. The federal and provincial governments provided $100 million of SRP grant funding specifically to clean up inactive sites in Indigenous communities across the province. The Alberta government worked with Indigenous communities, Indigenous businesses, the Indian Resource Council, and the Métis Settlements General Council to develop the details of this grant allotment. And that included $85 million for First Nations reserves and $15 million for Métis settlements to work with producers and contractors to close sites located on or around their lands. Now, First Nations communities and Métis settlements nominate and approve the eligible sites for closure work and work with producers and contractors to approve the spending. First Nations and Métis settlements can't apply directly to the government of Alberta for the funding. So once it's approved, contractors apply for the SRP grants. And then just one other thing I wanted to mention, through our work on this report, we had the opportunity to connect with Clayton and Kevin Heck of Arrowhead Abandonments, which is a First Nations project management and downhole tool company. The brothers were actively engaged, or they are actively engaged in both the SRP and a similar program, the Site Acceleration Program in Saskatchewan. And they said they've experienced the benefits firsthand, saying revenue has increased and they've had to double their workforce and contractor population. So looking beyond the benefits of the immediate well closure work, there are opportunities emerging to repurpose a portion of these assets into production again in support of renewable energy development. In particular, there's opportunities in emerging sectors like hydrogen, geothermal, or solar to repurpose orphan site infrastructure. And the experts that we talk to in these industries say the activities will require workers with many of the same skills as those in site closure work. An example of this is Renewal Energy Solutions. This Alberta company has been working with the municipal district of Taber to explore using abandoned oil and gas sites for small-scale solar generation. We had the opportunity to connect with Keith Hirsch, who is the founder and president of Renewal. And he said this approach takes advantage of the existing leases, power lines, and roads that are needed for solar development. At the same time, it reduces costs for lease reclamation and relieves competition for agricultural lands. And Keith estimates that about 10% of Alberta's abandoned well sites are viable for conversion to solar development. And then through our interviews and secondary research, we also identified a few challenges related to well closure activities and the site rehabilitation program. So the first challenge is related to the SRP timing and duration. So depending on the circumstances of each well site, it can take over 5 years for the site to revegetate and be ready for the detailed site assessment, which is required. The SRP's 2.5-year time frame for funding and work completion has sometimes spurred applicants to focus on shorter term activities, specifically the well abandonment and decommissioning stages. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, we see that about 60% of approved applications for funding are for abandonment work, and the remaining 40% are for remediation and reclamation work. And that's something that the Canadian Land Reclamation Association has been vocal in pointing out. Given that the reclamation stage is the most environmentally significant aspect of well closure, shorter term programs are not ideally suited to addressing some of the longer term issues. The second challenge is workers leaving the sector are creating skills gaps. With activity in Alberta's oil and gas services subsector picking up, demand for skilled and experienced workers is increasing. Many service companies report that finding workers with intermediate level experience, around 3 to 7 years, has become particularly challenged. What we're hearing from service companies is that intermediate level workers are generally at the stage in their life when they're looking to settle down or start a family or buy a house, and need more stability than the oil and gas services industry is perceived to provide. Another challenge the industry is facing is attracting youth and new entrants. In part due to the perception that the industry lacks innovation or has poor environmental performance. And then in the same way that the industry's history of expansion and contraction is a reason some workers are leaving the industry, it's also a deterrent for some of those considering entering the industry. And finally, several companies we interviewed for this report said the administration requirements associated with the SRP are particularly onerous for smaller organizations. From the application process to the invoicing to the reporting requirements, many said the administrative complexity is a challenge. So where do we go from here? Well, as we mentioned, the SRP is targeted to end March 2022, with all work to be completed by December 2022. Various stakeholders we talked to said it's important to keep the momentum going, to build a stronger skill set and labor market going forward, and to draw workers back or engage new ones in new and meaningful careers. There's also opportunity to appeal to a new generation of workers and promote the new technologies and growing environmental jobs in the energy industry. Research from the World Economic Forum found that just over 40% of youth indicated An employer's position on energy and environment are either a top or strong priority when determining career preferences. The SRP's focus on financial incentives and community initiatives to support more Indigenous involvement could prove to be a model to follow for future projects. One of the companies we spoke to said Indigenous involvement in reclamation can be part of the journey to reconciliation. And at their company, they really see it as their duty to work with Indigenous communities and support mentorship, training, and employment where they can. Then, as I mentioned, with the majority of the current SRP funding supporting the well abandonment stage due to shorter timelines, there's an opportunity to look at policy and future funding with a greater emphasis on land reclamation. The Canadian Land Reclamation Association is one organization that is advocating for reclamation specialists to be added to industry advisory panels on well closure activities. And they feel they can provide advice, expertise, and help shape programs and policies. And finally, other options for Canada's energy industry's asset beyond straight decommissioning and reclamation should be considered where appropriate. While it's best to claim most sites to be as close as possible to their original condition, Keith Hirsch from Renewal, who I mentioned earlier, estimates the average reclamation cost is about $40,000 per well in southern Alberta and even higher in northern Alberta. And it can be reduced by about 40 to 50% if a well site is converted to renewable energy development.
So we will open it up for some questions now. I did see Rod posted in the chat that he's heard that there are pipelines that can be repurposed as a conduit for fiber optics cable. So that's really interesting. I haven't heard about that yet. I know in Keith's case, you can read, we have a day in the life profile of him on our website. And he talks about the repurposing of the road access and a lot of the power generation, even utilities kind of for renewables. And that's how you can save so much money in transitioning your well site into something else. And hopefully we'll see more solutions like that, because it's encouraging to see what else can be done with these spaces. We will also, Lisette mentioned Clayton Heck, and we will be having a podcast released next week where Carol Howes, our VP, interviewed Clayton about his work and his background and what sort of careers that they are looking for at Arrowhead Abandonments. But I'm not seeing any other questions come in. I'll give you guys a couple minutes in case it's challenging to type everything out that you're thinking, I'm sure. And I do encourage you to join me in about half an hour where I will be doing a presentation on the occupations in demand with Jenny Peters from Eco Canada. And she'll be sharing the environmental outlook in Alberta and where some of the environmental roles will be.
And we do encourage you to take a look at the full report. It is on our careersinenergy.ca website. If you have other questions or are looking for more information that we didn't provide today.
I do see Winona asked about the expectations following December 2022. We haven't heard anything that the SRP will be extended, so I don't think that's the intention of the government. This was intended to be a stimulus spend, so I'll be surprised if it's continued. Perhaps the timing for the full completion will be extended, but I don't expect to see more funding. What will happen is the energy liability management framework and that rolling 5-year spend that's required by producers that will serve to continue the well reclamation work. And then the Orphan Well Association too will have an increased mandate under that new liability management framework, where they will help companies who, but hopefully before they are out of business, to produce their wells. And they'll be doing area-based closures to try to reduce costs going forward for those well closures that are needed. If there aren't any more questions, I will put up our last poll here, just asking if you found this webinar valuable. That's great. Everyone did find it helpful, so that's fantastic. Thank you very much for participating. If you do have any further questions, you can contact myself or Lisette. Our email addresses are there on the screen. If you have a data question, probably contact Lisette, but you can feel free to reach out to either of us. And as I mentioned, this recording will be posted onto our website by next week sometime. So you can watch for it and share it with anybody who you think might find value in it. And thanks very much for joining us today. Hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your Friday.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining us.